All right, it is now the time for apology and confession. And the apology is for the dubious quality of these talks. The theoretical part has been okay. Nothing special, but okay. It's important that we do have some kind of an understanding for how things are. We're responsible for what we teach and what we use, and we don't want to be misleading. So it's important that we're able to demonstrate why we use the principle of octavation as we do in astrology, and not be able to demonstrate as those, there's no explanation that other people have. It's very important anyway that we immerse ourselves in cosmography and cosmology. It's important that we do that because that's our evolutionary environment. Just as much as our physical environment, we have a spiritual environment, and we have to understand that. It's in the other part that the main part of the apology is found, and that is in the sample horoscopes. It can be okay to look at many horoscopes very briefly, but more should have been done to focus on octavation. I spent so much time and I still didn't find what I want. I should have probably looked more at horoscopes of accomplished spiritual people, because those are people where the octave characteristics come out the best. As it is, we have to deal with ordinary humans, and they respond mostly to the lower side. So hopefully some of you will take the attitude of seeing how shoddy this is and say, I'll show them how it should be done, and carry out what isn't in these talks. Now the confession is about something else. I have to confess that I am not certain that Pluto is the octave of Mars. I'm almost certain, but not completely so. Some things give evidence one way, and some things give evidence another way. Let's look at the former first, that Pluto is the octave of Mars. We have duly noted that octavation requires that a planet and its octave share a quality in common. That is, that they, like a middle C and a high C and a low C, all have the quality of C in them. Now, it is obvious with Mars and Pluto that both are about getting things done. They're both about something to do with the force that gets things done. Mars is an active doer, and action implies force, and it even identifies with it. Mars is an expression of kinetic energy, which means that it's energy in motion, and it is applied. And if the energy is blocked, that is, if we don't get our own way, it explodes in anger and in all directions. Mars isn't really too discriminating about directions as long as it's forward. Pluto is about power, the influence that determines the intensity of energy. Now, in physics, the quality of Pluto is called potential. Pluto rules Scorpio, and in Scorpio we find an excellent example. Scorpio is fixed water. And fixed water could mean any of several things. For one, it could mean ice. Because, well, I guess glaciers do flow a little bit, but that's really fixed water. Or it could mean something like swamp water. Swamp water doesn't move. There isn't even ripples on it from the wind as there is in a lake. But the example that is best is the water in a reservoir. That is the water that is behind the dam. And that gives us the whole business. The higher the dam is, and the more water there is behind the dam, the greater the potential, that is, the greater the intensity of the energy when it comes through the turbines at the bottom of the dam. It can be just like the stream was all along, so many gallons per minute going downstream, but if there is that big backwater behind the dam, when that same water comes through those tubes that feed the turbines, it comes through with a great deal more of pressure. And so even though the water standing behind the dam doesn't do anything, it's fixed, it puts pressure on the water that does go through. And Scorpio, or Pluto, is a planet of pressure. So we can see that there is this kind of relationship between Pluto and Mars, the relationship between potential and kinetics. Now, let's look at some of the more trying aspects of polar or potential octavation. Now, we've said that Neptune, in its higher manifestation, represents the human spirit, and that the transcendent or the higher Uranus represents the life spirit, the mystical side of things, where Neptune is the occult side. Using this kind of analogical ideation, we would say that the transcendent or the higher side of Pluto would rule the highest attribute of the threefold spirit, which is the divine spirit. Now, even with a very superficial consideration, this is pretty obvious. The character of the divine spirit is will. The will to be, the will to exist. And Pluto surely defines will. It is the planet for manifest will. Unmanifest or hidden will is found nowhere in the horoscope. So the personification of the divine spirit, the Father, is described as ever invisible. And Hades, which is the Greek name for Pluto, wore the helmet of invisibility and couldn't be seen. And when he was at home, he was lurking in the invisible dark underworld. Now, if you take the lower side of Pluto, it deals with I don't know how you would say it, the unwill. That is the stubbornness and the fixity that you find in compulsions or obsession or things of that nature. So it resists change. Rather than willing change, it resists change. So that the two higher and lower manifestations of Pluto sort of counter each other. Now, the power of will, when it's inverted, becomes sexual energy. Very important. But also very powerful and, I don't know how you'd say it, puts itself into its activity. Hades raped Persephone. He was rapacious and he was brutal. All right. Now, the doubts about the problems of the relationship of Pluto and Uranus arise with the reflective projection. Now, in an earlier talk, we mentioned that the higher manifestation of Uranus was in the life spirit, which David here would know as the Buddhic plane, and that its lower octave in another planet is Venus. And Venus is individual love or personified love, while Uranus, either in the higher manifestation or the lower manifestation, is altruistic. It becomes the masculine material planet of technology. We talked yesterday about when things, and looking at the diagram on the board, when things pass through the lens in the center of the mind, they become inverted. So the life spirit is the feminine, the imaginative principle that is impressed upon by the divine spirit, and the offspring is the human spirit. So the life spirit is feminine. But when it becomes inverted by passing through the lens, it becomes a masculine technical planet. This is why the octavation works as it does, and why some people are fooled into thinking that Uranus must be associated with Mercury, because they don't understand reflective projection or octavation. There's two different creative activities going on. Similarly, when Neptune is reflectively projected, it is reflectively projected into the lower part of the mind and the higher part of the desire body. And that is ruled, especially the lower part of the mind, is ruled by Mercury. So we can see that there is an octave relationship there. But where Neptune, on the other side of the lens, the transcendental side of the lens, is the magician, is somebody that is powerful in composition or in doing magical works or things like that, when it gets inverted, it becomes very passive, and you have the medium or you have the neurotic that alibis and has all of these long reasons why he couldn't do what was necessary to be done and things like that. Now, if we think about Pluto in that way, Pluto becomes the original creative power that issues from the deeper creator. Remember, the designations for the three powers of the spirit in one way are willing, feeling, and thinking, but on the other, another way of looking at it, they are creation, emanation, and fabrication. And the creation part comes from the divine spirit. When that becomes inverted into the lower Pluto, the all creativity becomes either asexuality or all sexuality. It's not creativity, it is sexuality. Now, so we can see that Pluto represents power. It's like a storage battery. The light that issues from that power is like the life spirit. And when that life spirit light gets broken down, it becomes abstract colors. And those colors of the human spirit, the individual, colorful individuals, when that gets reflectively projected into the desire world, it becomes the color of desires. And similarly, the spiritual life, the purposeful life of spirit, when it gets reflectively projected, it gets focused into the ethers. And that is the life in nature that can never be defeated, no matter what conditions. In a few days, oh, I gotta shut that off. My voice is tired enough that I don't want to compete with becomes the vital life that is in nature, so that even a few days after a volcanic eruption, new life is coming out. And when we look at the power of Pluto in the transcendent sense, that is of the divine will, when that is reflectively projected into the chemical region of the physical world, you have all of the resistance. Like when you wake up in the morning or late at night when you're tired, you recognize the resistance of the body. It's so almost like you're dragging your body along rather than your body being suspended in your own energy. So we can see in that way we get an explanation of the way the octaves work, and we can see these things carry on very well. But we want to look a little bit more, as these are problems that have been thought about for centuries. Every society has talked about unity and trinity. Very near to where Sharad was born, near Bombay, or in fact in Bombay, there is the famous Trimurti. It's a great big head statue, and it's a three-faced head, and the three faces on the head represent the three attributes of the one spirit. Now, Pluto is the demanding will, but when that gets reflectively projected into the personality, it becomes like an instinctual drive. And one of the chief instinctual drives is the drive to procreation, the continuance of the species. All of the very best materials are put into reproduction. Now, it's interesting that the sexual drive is not a matter of love. Now, if you look in the animal kingdom, there are animals that are affectionate with each other. And it's lovely to see that. But they are not affectionate with each other when they are mating. When they are mating, they are under that drive. They are under the heat, and it is something just has to be done. And so that's why it's a really important thing to realize that there's a tremendous difference between love and sex. If you have sex all alone, it becomes an act of power. Rape is an act of power. There's no love in that at all. In fact, the whole dealing with sex is a difficult thing because there's always power involved in it. That if you can produce very strong reactions in your partner, that's a feeling of power. And sometimes the feeling of power becomes more important than a kind of love that you're trying to communicate with the other person, even though the intensity is there for the communication, but sex is not a very good way of communicating. So, alright, so we can see that there is some relationship between Pluto and Mars as a result of reflective projection. All right. Now, when we mentioned yesterday talking about reflective projection, we said that that lens of the mind, which up there is which is drawn like an eye, it's both a reflector and a projector, and sometimes both simultaneously. We said that that was like a multiple focus lens, that it could focus in different ways at different times. And the way that the diagram is now is the way that it is in the cosmos now. It's certain that at other times in the cosmos, focus is going to be different. As the cosmos is dissolved in future states and worlds disappear and are absorbed into other worlds, that is accomplished by changing the focus of the mind and internalizing into the spirit things that used to be external, and that's done by a very variable focus lens. All right. So, the divine spirit, the life spirit, represent power and light and color. All right. With the divine spirit, it's a matter of invisible power. And in inversion, it becomes inert resistance. And this is where the problem enters in. Now, these are all teachings of the mysteries, and the mysteries are pretty much in agreement with them. The human spirit is reflected into the lower mind and the desire body. The life spirit is reflected into the vital body, and the divine spirit is reflected into the physical. Now we can see that there's something like the color of abstract color versus living color in the desire world, and there is something like purposeful spiritual life being associated with vital life in the lower, and we can see that there is something like power being reflectively projected into resistance. But if Mars is the lower octave of Pluto, it would have to have something to do with the chemical region of the physical world, which it does not. And that's why I can't say that I'm absolutely sure that Mars is the octave of Pluto. So we have to either say that that Mars is not the octave of Pluto, or there must be something else involved beside reflective projection. Because we can see that reflective projection is there, but what it means is something different. Now, I think what is happening is that something else is going on, and not merely reflective projection. And that something else which is going on is what we began talking about in the first place: resonance and octavation. If we go to a piano and we pluck a string, the string will vibrate, and so will some other strings, harmonics and such. Octave strings will surely vibrate. Now, in the earlier talk, we said that the cosmic planes and the worlds and the subdivisions were all undertones of one cosmic word. And that within the worlds that comprise our solar creation, that within that there was reflective projection between the worlds that are concrete and those that are transcendental or abstract. So we can see that there are two different kinds of activity involved in the evolutionary creation. One, as we have just seen, is harmonic resonance, and the other is reflective projection. Both are active. When we look at this business using this ugly diagram on the board, we can put it together. If we say that there is a resonance between the phenomenal worlds, the concrete worlds, and the ideational worlds, it then makes sense. Meaning to say, if we look at the physical world, especially the chemical region of the physical world, we find all of this differentiation into details that have many scientists working around the clock understanding all of the details of the material manifestation. And that resonates to the lowest of the transcendental things, the region of ideational thought, where all of the truths are separated out of the one truth of the life spirit. Similarly, there is a resonance between the vital life and the spiritual life. And if we follow this, there then must be a resonance between the desire nature and the divine spirit. And bingo, that's where we find Mars being an octave of Pluto. It's very hard for most people to even differentiate between will and desire. Most people feel that when they're asserting their will, they're knitting their brow and they're clenching their teeth. And that's not will. Will is so subtle that there's hardly any change in appearance. That's desire. And we build our will in the struggle with desire. We're told in the Rosicrucian philosophy that we're supposed to build moral muscle, and that comes primarily in the struggle with desire. So from this, since Mars is very strongly involved with the desire principle, we can see that there is a resonance between Mars and Pluto, between those two realms resonating with each other. All right, is that clear? Yeah, okay. So we can now have an understanding. This means, though, that the octavation between Mars and Pluto, if it's dependent on resonance, is different than the octavation that is dependent on reflective projection. Because in resonance, there is no alternation of gender or of polarity. And so something else has to take place. And because of the character of the divine spirit being what it is, and the character of Pluto is that same way. The divine spirit is all powerful. And it's always projected as the invisible Father. And it is extremely subtle, and in a way it's not even fair to gender it, because it's male and female and everything else, and it is omnigendered, or it is everything all rolled up in one. But when you get to the lower manifestation of Pluto, it is omnisexual. All the different forces of sexuality and the demands and the drives and the obsessive pushes and things like that. So even that seems to hold true. Now the whole business is, in order to demonstrate that this was true, you would have to have clairvoyant vision to see this. The same is true. You have to have clairvoyant vision to demonstrate to yourself whether reflective projection is true. But many, many seers have talked about reflective projection and the way that works. So with that, that's pretty much cross-checked and corroborated by a lot of people. There are some writers on spiritual subjects that do talk about resonance of the transcendent versus the phenomenal. Rudolf Steiner is one of them. So we're sort of on secure grounds here, but we can't say for certain. All right. Now we're ready to start looking at horoscopes. What?
Do you take questions?
Yes.
Okay, energy is potential. If we look at Mars not as force, but if we look in the frame of magnetics, would Mars still be in there?
Mars would be in there, but Mars is almost unknown without kinetic change.
No, kinetic change by magnetic and not by force?
That's a tough question. It goes both ways, because a vector of force sets up a field, and if that force happens to be electric, the field is magnetic. But a magnetic field applied to a vector like a wire produces a directed force. So there is some relationship there, but the potential, whether it is in the field or whether it is in the force, is invisible no matter which way you're doing it. You know what I'm trying to say? If you're hooked up to a power source like a battery or like the electric current, the power is always invisible. And the degree of the power means the degree of the field or the degree of the energy. The field in itself is usually a Oranian thing, whereas the directed vector of energy is the Marshall thing.
Well, I was thinking more along the lines of magnetic versus force, because I think force works in our Newtonian world.
Yeah.
But outside that doesn't seem to have the same operation.
Yes, I get at what you're saying. You're talking about like the magnetic application of power, like in doing mesmeric passes or doing magnetic healing, or those kinds of things. Yes, but it requires more explanation and more thinking out that I'm awake enough to do right now. I'm pretty tired. It's getting to be the end of the weekend. I'm approaching exhaustion. I really like the measured way you speak. You speak very softly, and it's persuasive. Not enough because it didn't draw me in. All right. We'll begin with the conjunction. And when Mars conjoins Pluto, the differences between power and energy are almost none. That is, the power is right there with the force. And in the world, this works out to be martial law. And I've noted over the years that almost every time that there is a conjunction of Mars and Pluto in the air, somewhere in the world there is a declaration of martial law. Mars alone expresses force, but it doesn't always have the power to back it up. Pluto has the power, but it doesn't like to apply it directly. And it has to have something like Mars to carry it out. Now this is somebody who has Mars conjoined Pluto and is a rather strong individual. I wouldn't want to tangle with her. This is the horoscope of our Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. This is quite a Mars-Pluto horoscope. If you see, the Mars and Pluto are in a strong conjunction, and they rule the sun sign. She's a Scorpio, and not only that, Mercury and Venus are also in Scorpio. Gemini is rising, and the ruler of Gemini, Mercury, is in almost 1 minute away from being perfectly square to Saturn. Quite strong.
What's the square of Saturn?
Mercury is square to Saturn. So what we're saying is that this is sometimes called an aspect of dishonesty. It doesn't have to be, but this indicates that as a diplomat, she can say yes, but mean no. And because of the Pluto-Mars part, she is a Teddy Roosevelt diplomat. She speaks softly but carries a big stick. And the thing that's interesting in this chart, this is a very growing chart spiritually, because the moon is void of course, which means the moon is what triggers and activates the other planets. She is the goddess of the chase, Diana, the goddess of the chase. And hunting the animals means that she goes around the circle and she spears each one of them into activity. But when the moon is void of course, that doesn't happen quite as strongly. And in remarkable people, the moon void of course means that they do everything on their own. I've noticed a lot of spiritual students, including myself, have the moon void of course, which means that if we're to be motivated, we're to be motivated on our own, in ourselves, and not because the stars have pushed us one way or another. So, this describes her a lot, but the whole chart is extremely fixed sign. There are 3 planets in Leo and 3 planets in Scorpio, which is really heavily fixed. So this is a determined type of person. This is a person so determined that she's never ever going to give up. The moon widely squares Uranus, and that's some kind of spiritual compensation. She can't be that determined, so she has her moments of getting into a little bit of hysteria. Jupiter is unaspected, so she's not a natural for idealism. Pretty weak. What? Oh! I missed that. My goodness. Missed that all altogether. All right. We'll pass on that. Yeah.
What?
Neptune trying the moon. Yeah. Neptune sextiles Mars and Pluto, which means that she does have some kind of charisma or something like that, but with the Jupiter being as it is, it's maybe not a lot of idealism. The reason that she was never really broken up by the shenanigans of her husband was in part because she's very strong, and in part because she's very cool to being cold. All right? The whole Scorpio and the whole Mars-Pluto thing is cold, like a rapist is cold.
How do you know that the moon is void of course?
Because it doesn't make an aspect until it enters the next sign. And it was in the very last degree of the sign, and it had been about 4 degrees before since it had made a sign, made an aspect. All right. Another way of looking at Mars and Pluto, it has to do with martial activity. Mars is a foot soldier. Pluto is a commander, like a general or a field commander or something like that. So Mars and Pluto conjoined is a commander who wants to maintain very close control over his troops. In this horoscope, the control comes from behind the scenes. This is the horoscope of Norman Schwarzkopf. This is the celebrated commander of the First Bush War. The qualities that we just mentioned of wanting to be in control from behind the scenes are the Mars and Pluto in the 12th house, but those things are countered by the Sun and Mercury in Leo in the first house, which is very, very outward. So we find a person here that is very divided. There's a strong thing pulling within and a strong need to be without. So there's a conflict. And this is something that runs throughout the entire chart. The Mars and Pluto are opposite to the Moon. So this is somebody who wants to plan and wants to plan, but he can't settle on a plan. Mercury and the Sun are opposite to Saturn, which is more of the same, more of the same. He's very, very divided as a man and can't make up his mind about a lot of things. But when he finally does, then the Mars-Pluto strikes deftly, and it strikes with power. The Mars-Pluto opposite the Moon is obsession about planning. Anytime there's a strong action, a strong aspect between Pluto and the Moon, it represents obsessiveness. Mercury and Saturn are detailed planning almost to the extreme of micromanagement. And so you can see that this is somebody plans and plans, and if he can't make up his mind, he gets angry. Now, fortunately, the Mercury and the Sun are in a opposite the Moon, are in a sextile trine relationship with Saturn, so there is some relief in that. Which means that if he takes it out of his own hands and shares the responsibility of the planning, that in that he can things can be mitigated. The same is true of the Mercury. No, that's all right. That side doesn't work. There's not a. All right, but this is a pretty good description of him. Now we come into something that is extremely hard to talk about, even just psychologically talk about it. The 4th, 8th, and 12th houses are the houses of secrecy and sneaking. This is somebody who was extremely sneaking. Does everybody know who David Berkowitz is? Yeah, he was the son of Sam, murderer. We're looking now at the Mars sextile Pluto. The Sun is basically unaspected, very wide conjunction to Jupiter, but not really enough for it to be an aspect. So the Sun is also vaguely, very vaguely trine to the Moon, so that doesn't count. So he doesn't have a strong self. And what happens if you don't have a strong self? The personality takes over and it does its own thing. And in this case, he had some very remarkable talents. But he let those things take over. Pluto is in the 10th house. Along with the Sun being in the 12th house, he's fascinated with death. And with that fascination with death and feeling insecure himself, he feels he would be powerful if he could kill people. Now, this is not just a psychological misconception of things. This is an occult fact. In order to be initiated into some very nasty black magic cults or just evil-doing cults, you have to murder someone. I knew a person who was an initiate, who was a drug dealer on the Mexican border many years ago, and he talked about having to do that. To be accepted into the work that he did, he had to murder someone. And there are some excellent occult novels, if you can stand to read them, about people gaining power by murdering other people, especially if you could murder them with your own hands. So this is not just something dreamed up by the man as a psychopath. So there is a mega strong double sextile trine. Mars and Mercury are very closely conjoined, and Saturn and Pluto are very closely conjoined, and they trine each other. And then all of them sextile Pluto. So what we have here is something, when aspects are very close-orbed, there is not a lot of leeway or a lot of tolerance. When they're once set in motion, the motion just takes over and they run on their own. One of the things we want to point out is we've been showing all along that with the sextile, there is reflection and you spread out from one thing to another thing to another thing. In fact, he started out by being a pyromaniac. And after having done that, he stabbed a few people. And then after that is when he went into murdering people with a pistol. Now, this is an important chart to look at, because sometimes we associate what are called good aspects, sextiles and trine, with people being good. They can be misused, especially when the sun representing the self is weak. One gets involved with the talents and it doesn't direct them to positive ends. This is especially so with the sextiles. The inverse also works. There are saints that have had as many as 9 squares in their charts. So if you see a chart with a lot of squares, it doesn't mean that it's somebody who is evil. Now, if you are a mathematical student of astrology, this is one to study. I didn't do it myself, so I can't say. But going back to William Lilly, who was probably one of the most stupendous astrologers ever, some sextiles act as squares instead of sextiles, and some squares act as trines, and it all depends on oblique ascension, and you have to be able to measure oblique ascension and see, because what you're talking about is, though on the zodiac they may be sextile, but on the angle of incidence at the Earth, they may be square to each other. And these are things, there are ways that you can figure it out. William Lilly gives you some of them, and other mathematical astrologers are giving you others, so that you can determine the times that the sextile is a malefic versus being a benefic. All right. I think by the time we're over tonight, I will have no voice and no brain to drive it. I'm going to say very little about this horoscope, but it is the perfect Mars-Pluto horoscope. Very, very strong sextile between Mars and Pluto. And this is probably the greatest female athlete that has ever been in the United States. She's most famous as a professional golfer, but she was a world-class champion in hurdles, in throwing the javelin, and in basketball. She had a touring basketball team, and in baseball she toured with a baseball team, and she even played football, and she played matches against world champions in pool and in tennis. So this is diversification. If this doesn't demonstrate the diversification that comes with the sextile, nothing will. We don't have anything more to say beyond that. Yep, okay.
Pluto conjoined them. It happened to you. Does that really get some of that?
Yes. It has something to do with the fame and the influence that she has in the world. I think that the women's pro tour wouldn't have the currency that it has now if it hadn't been for her, because people would go out to see her because she was just such a phenomenon. I think she could drive every bit as far as a male could drive. All right, now we're starting to the squares of Mars and Pluto. This is Bruce Lee. When we try to use energy to direct the power, or when the power tries to be active other than through the energy, things get into a tough situation. When energy and power are at cross purposes with each other, they meddle in each other's business. And that describes what happened in this person. Now, this is not an easy horoscope to understand, because the better part of this individual worked through the horoscope was much, much more than the horoscope. Now, the Sun conjoins the ascendant, and it's trine to Pluto, which shows self-control. Pluto is potential will. The Sun is available will. And when the available will gets turned into kinetics, that is what is indicated by Mars. So this person had a lot of will. But there is a will that doesn't show up in the horoscope. You can see when a person is going to have an evolutionary trial for initiation, but you don't know what the result is going to be, because that depends on something that is much more than the horoscope. This is somebody who did use his will both through and without the horoscope. There is a major, major T-square here. Pluto squares Saturn and Jupiter on one hand, and it squares Mars and the Moon on the other hand, but the Moon also conjoins Mercury, which is opposite to Saturn. So this is one of those overlapping squares that is very hard to read. And we can't really go into the horoscope because there are so many sub-aspects. You have to look at the Mars-Jupiter and the Mars-Saturn, and you have to look at the Pluto-Jupiter and the Pluto-Saturn. They each add ingredients, and they produce mixtures that are different from the ingredients. So it's really a hard thing it takes some time to ponder this. Now, we do discipline to gain self-control, which is obviously the case here. But sometimes, if we don't use the self-control purposefully to other ends, the discipline becomes an end in itself. And this is what happens with the Mars square Pluto. It happens with all Mars Pluto. It can happen with all Mars Pluto, but it happens most with Mars square Pluto. It is where discipline becomes an end in itself, and you live to be able to do more and more and more push-ups, for example. Now, even though he is in himself cool and composed, he lives in a world that is not so, because all of those T-squares means there's a lot of violence in his life. And he got into martial arts because he was a street fighter. And as a street fighter, both in Hong Kong and in the United States, he got whooped really badly. And his pride would not allow that. Sagittarius is a sign that's not without pride, to say the least. And so he studied martial arts and got better at it than you could imagine. This is a man who was so deft that if you had a quarter in your hand and he told you to close your hand, before you could get your hand closed around the quarter, he could take the quarter and leave you 2 dimes in its place. There is, I want to see the horoscope of this man, but there is, Jerry's got the video of it, the fastest drawer in the West. It is astounding how fast this man can draw a gun. It looks like he's just standing there, and it's in thousandths of a second that he has drawn a gun, and he shoots straight through 2 targets and puts the gun back in the holster, and you think he hasn't moved. And you watch the video, and the video is not faked. There are 6 or 7, we're away from Bruce Lee now, I'm so tired of everything's going everywhere. There are 6 or 7 different kinds of contests of drawing a weapon, and this man holds the world's record in all of them. I'll talk to Jerry and see if I can get that URL for being able to do that. Now, how he will use this is what is important. Because he didn't have an end other than self-protection and self-mastery. Self-mastery is a wonderful thing, but you master yourself not for yourself, but for some other end. This is why the Rosicrucian philosophy is so important, because the other end is Christian. It is serving others. You care less about yourself, and you develop spiritual powers not for the joy for yourself, but so that you can do something to help others or to help creatures and to help the whole evolution go forward. You have to have something purposeful. This man continued to get into fights all of his life. And when Saturn conjoins Jupiter, especially in Taurus, it's poor judgment because of greed. It's almost like he had a greed for violence. If Jupiter is stronger, you do too much, and if Saturn is stronger, you do too little. And so this is a life that has constant conflict, and it lives on constant conflict. Now, there's something very interesting about this. Again, another side trip that has nothing to do with the horoscope. But there is a reasonable question about the origin of martial arts, because martial arts have a lot to do with healing. And some people believe that martial arts turned into healing as an evolution because you've hurt so many people that now you want to be able to heal them, and it turns out as a guilt compensation. Now, that's possible with Scorpio, but it's also possible that it goes the other way, that people, for example, who were healers studied every nerve in the body and every acupuncture point so that they could heal people. But in cases of needing to defend themselves, they knew how to defend themselves with the least amount of energy possible. And I don't know, though some of you might know, I know Bob used to do Aikido, I don't know which is the origin of which, whether healing came out of martial arts or whether martial arts are a degeneration out of healing. I do know that Chi masters do have contests that are like martial arts where one overpowers the other, but they never touch each other. They do it only by the application of the Chi energy. That is correct, isn't it, Bob?
I don't know.
You don't know, and you're the doctor of healing acupuncture, not of gossip and saying about all kinds of other things. I suppose we're overstayed already. Oh, this is a tough day. This is the tough part of the day. Oh, there's a Son of Sam wasn't enough, this is one. Being co-rulers of Scorpio, which is the most brutal sign in the zodiac, the sign of butchers and undertakers and people like that, there are a lot of ugly possibilities in the struggles between Mars and Pluto. When they're opposite to each other, as they are in this case, they're pulling different ways, and the worst comes out of both of them. Mars, as we said, deals with kinetic energy, and it is violence. Pluto deals with the potential energy, and the potential energy in relation to violence is the threat of violence. The threat that's hatched in schemes of silence. The threat in violence, after violence has once been perpetrated, increases greatly. And that threat of violence is what we call terrorism. This is the horoscope of a terrorist. A few years ago, we did the horoscope of a terrorist that had no indications to terror in the horoscope. And I said I couldn't understand that. And then somebody in the group said, well, this is that guy that was bragging that he was a terrorist in the bar and they arrested him when he really wasn't a terrorist. We're really on our own in this case because this Domenici Massimo Domenicini is a real terrorist, but we have absolutely no biographical information on him. If you search the web, all you find are very obscure records from the international courts, and they don't even go into detail about how or when or why he, those are all sealed records and you can't get them off of the net. But it's from the International Court of Justice. You want to look it up, you can find it. Pluto's in the 10th house, indicating he wants to demonstrate power over the world. And what he professes is the 10th house, and terror is what he professes. Now this is interesting because there's a conservation of the soul. The Venus and the Moon are conjoined in Aquarius, which would indicate a humanitarian. But they form a mutual reception without aspect to Uranus. And mutual receptions can be very powerful. You get into a certain track. And I'm just guessing on this, but my guessing goes this way, that there is a Venus-Moon interrelationship with Uranus, which would indicate some very latent or maybe hidden tendencies toward homosexuality or something very feminine-like. And having Libra rising increases that. It's sometimes seen as a dainty, delicate sign. And in a macho society where people like to show the hair on their chest, that the reaction to that is the reaction that gets him into being a terrorist. Now, I can't say that I know this is true. It's all speculation, but it does make sense to me. Mercury is square to Saturn in this horoscope, and it's a fairly strong square. And I don't think it means dishonesty in this case as much as it means scheming. And that fits into, this is somebody that would be very furtive and would work things out in that way. All right. We should keep on going. One more difficult chart to deal with, then we get to the trine. Not really too difficult either. This is Rosie O'Donnell, and probably more of you know more about her than I do. This is a woman who has an off-and-on situation with popularity. Sometimes she's very, very popular and everybody wants to put her on their television network or whatever, and then sometimes she's not so. There's also a lot of self-ambiguity in this. The Sun and Venus are in Aries, which are masculine. But at the same time, the Moon is in Libra, which is very feminine. So they're each in themselves, each positioning in itself has inversion of gender tendencies, and then the inversion that comes from the opposition indicates there's all kinds of ambiguity in this. And the ambiguity is not just emotional, and it's not just physical ambiguity. Jupiter is opposite to Uranus. And so there is a speculative quality. This is, the Jupiter opposite Uranus is a kind of thing where you exaggerate some crazy idea so far that it becomes funny. And this is not quite Jerry Springer-like, but it's a fascination with the odd and how quirky, funny, odd it all is. And then there's Mercury, which is opposite to which is part of the Mars-Pluto opposition. Mars and Mercury in Pisces indicate a very quick mind, but a mind that, it's sort of like trying to be very quick with a motorcycle on a frozen lake. It's a lot of spinning, but it doesn't get anywhere. The opposition to Pluto indicates, again, who's in control. Is the mind in control, or is it just will and desire that is in control? This is somebody that has a really difficult time knowing herself, and she gets pulled apart. Like what kind of action should I take, or what shouldn't I take? The Aries planets indicate action, the Pisces planets indicate action, but then when the action occurs, what happens is guilt comes out. All of the Mars-Pluto afflictions relate to guilt, but especially the opposition, because you can see the separation between cause and consequence, or between the deed and the aftermath, so we can see this is a person with a lot of guilt. And can you imagine what it's like for this person to be before millions of people and to make those misslips and exaggerate things? It's a tough thing. All right. Now we come to the horoscope, one of the most misunderstood people in entertainment history. This is the horoscope of Mae West. Now, normally when you think of Mae West, you think of big boobs, or you think of sex, or you think of both. And the reality is, unlike many other people in entertainment, in her, anything that she did, she never undressed, she never used profanity, and she was in plays, and she was in movies, and there was sex implied, but she never ever did any of the things that are very commonplace now. And this is shown in the horoscope. Neptune is in the first house, so her outer image is kind of weird. But it's with Pluto, so it's all tied up with sex. And so you can see that this is, she puts forth a powerful sexual image. Now, Mercury is square to Neptune conjoined Pluto, that conjunction in the first house. And so the way that works out is there's some psychological ambiguity about it. And with Mercury, it comes out in wit. Now, Mercury-Pluto squares indicate somebody who is stumped. Their mind is boggled. And in order to relieve the mind boggling, she puts it out through expression, through fifth house expression. And, and that's, so what she was thinking, she was actually trying to get away from the subject, but she knew the power of it, and she knew she was defined by it, and she knew it was all show business, but she was still trying to, in her weird mind, she was still trying to work that out. Now, she's likable. She's really likable because the Sun is trying to Jupiter, and everybody likes to be like, they're in hidden houses, so all of that positivity is bubbling up to the surface, and she's a really likable person. Now we come to the trine. The Mars energizes the Pluto-Neptune conjunction. The Mars-Neptune gives it charisma. And so that the Mars-Pluto gives it power. There is an emotional potency to her personality, and that's what carried through. And she knew the power of sexuality, and she knew how to utilize it. Even though she was intellectually or mentally insecure about it, she felt out what you could do with it, and did that with it, and it went all to her advantage. All right. Come to the last horoscope. Now, the last half of the 19th century was called the Gilded Age, and it was sometimes called the Age of Plutocracy, because we were in the Pluto-Uranus cycle in the same place that we are in it now. Capitalism was the order of the day, and we're right now in terms of multinational capitalism. So let's look at an enthusiast for capitalism. A horoscope of Mark Twain, who was a big mouthpiece speaking in favor of capitalism, especially if you read A Connecticut Yankee in the Court of King Arthur. We know him for his eternal boyhood, his eternal childhood. The sun in Jupiter is something like a boy who never ever grows up. And the sun conjoins Mars, and Mars is in the very strong trine with Pluto, and you can say that he knew the joy of power and energy in play because he had the boyhood that he had. That sums up this trine, the multi-planet trine. You can even bring the moon in there, and so that, it's really a good portrait of him.
Did you misspeak? You said the sun and Jupiter was boyhood?
The first house is boyhood. Okay. Sun and Mars, and then they trine the Pluto and the moon. Okay. We're now talking about Jupiter, which we haven't gotten to before. Jupiter is in the 9th house, and the 9th house is a sense of proportion. And Jupiter is exalted in Pluto and Cancer, and so he can get ebullient. He can bubble over, and one of the things that he does with humor is he knows how to exaggerate in such a way that when you take things out of proportion, it isn't just clowning. When you take things out of proportion, you can see how ridiculous they all are. And that was the ability that he had. But that is the Jupiter square to the moon, and it is square to Pluto, and he knew the power of humor, but he would get carried away with it himself. The situation is that he knew how to take this sense of proportion and bring it out through Mercury. This is where his wit was. He could put things into words that would show that misproportion from things being overblown. The man himself, apart from the horoscope, is a very complicated man. He was like his horoscope. He went through, again, it's one of those conservation of the soul things, for as positive and cheery and even overboard as he was with happiness, he does have the Neptune square to Saturn. So he had periods of depression and those sorts of things. Jupiter rules both the 2nd and the 5th houses. And the Jupiter part in its square to the moon and Pluto is he didn't know the difference between investment, which is the 2nd house, and speculation, which is the 5th house. So he lost huge amounts of money. He had so much money coming in, he didn't realize that there has to be a proper relationship between what's coming in and what's going out. He could have filed for bankruptcy. He didn't want to do that. So what he did is he went on speaking tours. And he traveled the country and the world over giving speaking tours until he paid off every last debt of every person that he knew. In this case, the Mars trine Pluto represents the positive side of capitalism. Meaning to say, you have to have power in order to direct energy, and energy produces wealth, and then that wealth gets spent, and that produces more opportunities for power to accrue. So he was a very positive capitalist. Strangely enough, he was also a non-capitalist. He belonged to a union, and he belonged to abolitionists, and he dabbled in everything. He was even a psychic in that he was able to predict his brother's death from a dream that he had and got it very accurately. All right, that should be plenty enough for today, so let's close with the Rosicrucian student's prayer. O God, increase our love for Thee, so that we may serve Thee better from day to day. Let the words of our mouths and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in Thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Well, thank you very much. It's been fun. I didn't get a recording last night